Welcome to Just Think About It with Nadine and Ben. We're recording this episode on Thursday, November 21st, 2024. Before we start our conversation, we have two key requests. First, if you're enjoying our podcast, please subscribe via Apple, Spotify, X, YouTube, or your platform of choice, and make sure to hit the like button. Second, we appreciate any kind notes and feedback and would appreciate you letting your friends know where to find us. Today, we're thrilled to introduce you to Michael De Clercq, a successful entrepreneur and operator in the global sourcing business with expertise sourcing in China. Michael's had the front row seat through the rise of China into the global manufacturing behemoth that it is today, having built his operations in China in the 1970s, well before almost any other Westerners were there. In 1978, Michael founded China Performance Group Sourcing and Transcontinental Trade and Finance, two complementary firms that provided Chinese sourcing solutions, including supply chain management, logistics, China market entry, as well as sales and marketing services. For the past 15 years, Michael's also served as the senior China advisor to CRH plc, the Irish-based global Fortune 500 construction materials company. Michael is fluent in 4 languages and is truly an international citizen, and I hear an amazing ping pong player. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. And before we get started, I wanted to thank, first of all, Nadine and Ben for inviting me to this podcast, and also to congratulate them on this excellent format. I love to be part of something that makes people think.
Well, that's our goal here. So, Michael, I've learned a lot from you about China. And, for the listeners, as they just heard, you've been involved in China for a long time. But maybe just give some perspective how a young 20-year-old Belgian guy found himself in China in the 70s, where there wasn't many Westerners there. And, we maybe start from that point, and then how that brought you to maybe say, hey, I want to do business in China. Because these were radical ideas back then.
Yes, they were, Ben. I guess I was involved in China through the bias, I guess, of academic circles. I started to study Mandarin Chinese at university because I was fascinated by the idiosyncrasy of the Chinese script. That's what got me interested first. And if you try to connect this to business, there was no business sense at the time. Many of my friends were making fun of me, saying, hey, if you're interested in doing business in Asia, you should learn Japanese, not Chinese. I mean, what, you want to do business with Taiwan, which at the time was this tiny little outpost that wasn't doing much? The answer was no. I was interested in business, but paradoxically, I was also fascinated by this thing that had no relevance whatsoever, and that was the Chinese script, primarily the script, and linked to that, of course, the Mandarin language. So you could say, Ben, that I was motivated by a youthful lack of fear and conventional logic.
And a love of learning, it sounds like.
Absolutely. The Chinese language was, again, the script was very different, Nadine, from the languages I knew, mostly in the sense, and maybe the listeners might not understand this, but because contrary to our alphabet system, with the Chinese script, you can read and write that language without speaking it.
Right.
In other words, you can speak English and still read Chinese script. And that's what fascinated me.
I have 3 kids who study Mandarin, so I'm legally aware that I don't.
Well, you can also take that in reverse, right? Where you can speak it and not write it, right?
Well, that's correct. But I mean, but now you're talking about a very different dynamic, Ben. I mean, the script, which is the concept of pictograms and ideograms, in comparison with our system of alphabet, is one that allows people who do not speak the language to be able to read the books, the poetry, and everything related to Chinese culture. You can't do this in in our culture. You can't read a French book if you don't speak French, even though you can understand what the alphabet, what the words are, put together, the letters, but you don't know what it means. In Chinese script, you can, and that's
Right.
That's what fascinated me.
Right. It has a little bit of a hieroglyph aspect to it, in essence.
You're correct. That's right.
All right. So all right, we're here. You're in your early 20s. You're in China. You're like seeing the opportunity in front of you as things start to open up a little bit. But let's talk about business for a second. This is 1978. There was no internet. There was phone calls were wildly expensive. I mean, my local phone call from Madison, Wisconsin to Milwaukee was a wildly expensive call, let alone calling from Europe or United States to Beijing. And what about, the fact that you had to do business, both sides obviously had to have a physical presence. Talk about that learning curve of creating an international commerce platform where you saw the opportunity of costs were going to be driven down from all this labor that was coming online to a high cost Western world that would really want to drive costs down, and in how hard that was.
Yeah, well, look, again, as usual, right, Ben, it depends what you compare it to. So you are correct that if you compare China at the time to today, it seems unfathomable that you could do all of that stuff without the internet, without, good means of communication, putting aside the phone. We didn't have, we were using telex machines at the time. Most of you don't even know what that is. But it's an instrument that you cannot use, or at least it's incredibly difficult to use, for example, to send pictures. There is a weird way to do it, but I won't go into that. And then you had a progression from the telex to the fax, and then eventually to the internet. And all of those things, as you pointed out, Ben, became cheaper. It became exponentially better, and at the same time, somewhat paradoxically, cheaper. But again, depends what you compare it to. We were all in the same boat. So it didn't really matter that I didn't have access to, iPhones and things nobody else had, and so it was an even playing field at the time. And the trick was, what can you leverage in your favor to get an edge on the competition? For example, we were one of the first offices in Beijing to have our own telex machine, which meant that you didn't have to go to the telex building to send a telex for $7 a minute. You could do it from your office, and more importantly, you could receive telexes directly in your office as opposed to transmitting them to typically your Chinese business partner, which made confidentiality a bit of an issue, if you can understand that. But again, you're asking about, as a 20-year-old, the launching into China was very exciting, and partially very exciting because it was so difficult and unconventional.
And so when you're faced with such a massive raw opportunity that so many iconic companies, made Nike and Ralph Lauren, and that was just a gigantic trade for 40 plus years. I mean, what was the strategy and how did it evolve when you saw sourcing of like, hey, I can get you cheap stuff, to like, what was your role? Was it connecting? Was it the servicing? Like, where did you see your role, and where did you see, the other factors that contributed to this enormous secular trend that really changed the world in the last 40 years?
Right. Well, again, it's difficult to comprehend, but in the very early days, in the late 70s and into the 80s, a big part of sourcing from China was convincing people that it was a good idea. It's not so much like, this is fantastic, what role do I have to play? It was much more, let me tell you why it's fantastic, and if you do it with me, you're going to be successful. And the funny thing was, contrary to today, you had to convince the vendors, the Chinese vendors, nearly as much as you had to convince the American buyers that it was a good idea. Your competition at the time, from a geographical point of view, was Taiwan and South Korea for consumer goods, and the way to make China imports work was price, and not at the time logistics. So, for example, Taiwan, you can place an order and you could turn it around in a week. In China, it would take you at least a month. It was a huge detrimental factor. The only way that you could make it interesting was with a very good price. And typically, the pricing that we got our clients was in the 30 to 40% better than what they got from these other places. So you're not talking about, 5%, 6%. You're talking about huge price differences. People, that got their attention. They were willing to try. And the problem was, who do you get to execute these orders? And obviously, we were practically the only game in town.
And so, okay, we evolved from that early days to then just walk us through up to the present day. Like, what were the key events? Like, obviously, NAFTA was big for, in America going to Canada and Mexico. And then the WTO was probably the seminal event that people can look back on. But like, when you think about that ramp curve, when did you see it really starting to accelerate, I guess? Like in terms of the 80s, the 90s, was it in the 2000s?
Okay, well, I mean, if you go back into deep context, when I first got to China, China was as anachronistic, if you want, or as bizarre as the Chinese script was to the alphabet. And by that, I mean that, for example, China was, the dominant thing in China was this communist regime, right? Which we tend to forget a little bit about today, although Xi Jinping has reminded us of it a bit more the last few years. But, for a long time, the word communist was not prevalent in our perception of China. But in those days, it was just, that's the way things were. And what it translated for a Westerner and a businessman that was really stood out was that, number one, money meant nothing. Money had no value, which is weird. Real estate, which for us is so fundamental, it's such a fundamental aspect of wealth, meant nothing. Real estate had zero value. And so you were dealing, as a young guy, I was dealing in an environment that was bizarre. For one, theft was practically non-existent. Corruption was not a factor. There was no corruption in the early days. You felt incredibly safe in that respect. And but all your rules were different in China. And so you start with that. And then you go and you say, hey, we could make business here. Well, first of all, that's an unknown concept as well. And in the early days, Ben, all business transactions in China were done through what was known as the FTCs, the Foreign Trade Corporations. And coincidentally, and here there is a strong element of serendipity, if you want, because I was this maverick young guy that had learned Chinese and decided this crazy thing. I was going to go into China to do business, even though there was no logic or rationale to it. But I was lucky. And so, for example, all business in China was done through foreign trade corporations, which were state-controlled, state-owned enterprises that controlled everything about exports. And very rigorous limits. You were doing textiles or chemicals, and you had to deal with different corporations. Well, that regimen stopped in 1978, which is when Deng Xiaoping started to become active. So if you're looking, Ben, if I understood correctly, you're looking for certain milestones. I guess the first milestone was the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. Now, I was in China in 75 and 76. I was at the funeral of Zhou Enlai, who was sort of a smaller milestone, but an important one in 1976. I wasn't there when Mao died. But I knew it was going to be a pivotal event. China was going to go one way or the other, and China went the way we know. So that's an important thing. 1978 was when Deng Xiaoping basically started to get traction, and he moved towards, if you want, reforms. And you had a few important other milestones in terms of what promoted the growth of Chinese exports. Through those reforms of Deng Xiaoping, you had a movement away from centrally controlled foreign trade corporations, first to provincial ones, and that introduced an element of competition. In other words, you could buy a cotton shirt at a better price perhaps from Hebei province than you could do from Heilongjiang, whereas before you bought it from Chinatex and you didn't even know where the shirt was made. And then the next step in that progression was that individual enterprises were allowed to bid for your business. And so you had the rise of private enterprise. And again, we think we take that for granted, but it wasn't. And so private enterprise, which, as you know, became the dominant factor of Chinese exports, only started to grow in the early 1980s. And again, keep in mind, I don't want to complicate things, but the concept of private enterprise is difficult sometimes to understand. There often is a state component to them. These people would take over government factories, but they would really run the business as a private enterprise. I mean, that's probably the subject for a completely different conversation. Then the big milestone, Ben, was Most Favored Nation in 1980, which was a regulatory agreement between the United States and China that basically said, it's called Most Favored Nation, but the new word for it a few years later was NTR, which is normal trade relations. In other words, China was treated like everybody else. And that made the tariffs and, those elements of U.S. imports much easier for China to navigate. Problem was, of course, every year it had to be reapproved, and that created anxieties at a geopolitical level, but overall it went fairly well. And then you had the WTO, of course. That was the mammoth, the big factor. And that happened in 2001, but it had been negotiated for about 11 years, so it really happened in 1990, which was interesting because then you sort of think, well, were there any scary setbacks in doing business in China during that period? And there were a couple of scary setbacks. One of them was the Vietnam War, the Sino-Vietnamese War, which a lot of people don't think about. But it happened in 1979. And those of us living in China at the time were afraid that the USSR was going to nuke Beijing. It sounds silly today, but that was a concern then. And then, that didn't last. That only lasted a few months. And then the other big event that you are familiar with was the Tiananmen incident, otherwise known as the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. And I was living in Beijing at the time. And that portended a huge step backwards. I mean, a lot of companies actually closed their doors. That was from a business point of view, very scary. From a political domestic politics point of view, it was very ominous. But in the end, it was much ado about nothing because, as I said, the WTO negotiations started the next year in 1990. So I don't know if that helps answer the question, Ben, but these are the milestones in my view.
And Michael, can I fast forward you today? I'm still going to take you back into history a little bit, but probably one of the most timely topics of people listening and the insights that they would love to glean from you is the new incoming administration here in the U.S. and the discussion of tariffs, right? So it would be really great to hear from someone who, has done business there for so long, who understands incentives, alignment, misalignment, regulation, currency, so many different factors. What are your expectations of what may come to pass, whether that's time frame, levels of tariffs, areas of focus from our side, and then the response of Xi, right? Because it's not a one-player game; it's a multiplayer game here. What are your thoughts on what's most likely to happen?
Yeah, well, excellent question. I'm glad you picked the easy ones, Nadine.
No, just give me one word. No.
So, I mean, look, from my point of view, tariffs are a geopolitical tool, right? And in that sense, they serve a purpose in politics as long as motive is understood. And when you think about this, you hear a lot about, how great tariffs are. Some people say tariff is the greatest word in the dictionary. I forget who said that. But you have this whole thing about this wonderful thing about tariffs. But a lot of people forget to ask, why exactly do we do it? What is the motive? And in my view, there are some good reasons to impose tariffs. One of them, for example, would be anti-dumping. If you sort of notice your counterpart is basically stealing market share by cheating, makes sense to levy tariffs against them. But that's sort of a laser focus type tariff. It's not across the board. Another one is reciprocity. And what I mean by that is, if a country says to you, look, I'm going to raise 20% on the tariffs on your cars, and you're raising 4% on their cars, it kind of makes sense to say, what the heck, I'm going to raise 20% on your cars too. That's reciprocity. That's, in my view, where tariffs make sense, where you keep in mind the motive. Why do I impose tariffs? If you don't consider those things, I think that tariffs are useless, anti-capitalistic, and inflationary. And frankly, politicians use tariffs as a story to advance their agenda, not because tariffs are economically useful, but because it gets them votes. And you have this whole nostalgia thing about losing manufacturing jobs. It's a compelling storyline. It's a compelling narrative, but it's not factual and it's not logical. And, as far as businesses are concerned, there's not much businesses can do if voters buy the story and go with the concept of tariffs. So businessmen have to deal with the uncertainties that these tariffs create. And it's important to understand this is an uncertainty because you're injecting in the supply chain an element that A, you cannot control, and B, that can be removed very quickly, contrary to setting up a supply chain, which takes time and effort. Tariffs is like throwing a spanner in the works. It's very difficult to anticipate and to deal with. And if you do deal with it and somebody takes the spanner out, you're again confronted by great difficulties. So when you say with this current administration, the coming administration, what is my view on tariffs and how businesses are going to deal with it? It's a difficult question, but it's mostly difficult because we don't really know what's going to happen. All we know is, again, the story. We know what people tell us. We know about 60% tariffs on China, as much as 200% on Mexico. It could be 10 to 20% across the board for the whole world, friends and foes alike, right? This is what we're told. Is that really going to happen, though? We don't know. It's like the balls are all up in the air. Think of a juggler. And in reality, we know that economically speaking, it's unlikely that all of these things will happen. And it's certainly unlikely that they will happen fast.
Yes.
Again, tariffs are a geopolitical tool. they can be very useful as a threat.
Right.
Once you execute that threat, the usefulness starts to go away. But so in terms of businesses, I think the short answer is there will be winners and losers, as always. I think the winners will address tariffs with wisdom and agility, and the losers will tend to panic and react hastily. I know it's probably not a specific enough answer for you.
Way you said wisdom and agility. What can a management team do, either in China or here in the U.S.? Because most, or I guess maybe I'll pause that. Is that, let's say it's 20 to 60% tariffs on our side. What does China do?
Okay, so if tariffs go up by especially that huge number, 60%, what China will most likely do is a combination of a number of factors. One, they will subsidize their exporters.
Yeah.
So people that, and again, if you use the math and, you have a product that sells for $10, you're a big buyer, your vendor will say, tell you what I'm going to do, I'll sell it to you for $8. That's
Right.
20% less. But you'll still be competitive with that. And so that's going to be one aspect I'm pretty sure of. Another aspect is there's going to be, in my opinion, a weakening of the renminbi. Now that's a factor, but keep in mind that for a lot of China merchandise, the weakening of the renminbi doesn't have a huge impact. Think of, for example, the iPhone that are assembled in China in large volume. Something like 90% of the iPhone is made outside of China. I mean, the components, it's the assembly part that's renminbi driven. So that doesn't have a huge impact, but it will affect the bottom line. And at the end of the day, from the buyer's point of view, from the importer's point of view, they're going to be looking at this important factor of quality, price, reliability, and they're going to say, well, if I'm slapped with 60% tariffs, first of all my you're back into this, I'm in the same boat as everybody else. All my competitors will be faced by the same thing. So it's not so much an issue of what do I do in the void, but what do I do compared to them? Right. As long as I can do better than them, I'm going to be fine. And so they're looking at alternatives, and these alternatives, depending on the product, will involve moving part of the production out of China. And then you're going to be faced with the quandary of where do I move the products to Vietnam, which seems to be a choice destination. But keep in mind, Vietnam is a communist country. Nobody knows if they're going to be subject to tariffs as well. I tell you what, nearshoring is a good idea. Why don't I move my products to Mexico? Oh, wait, Mexico. They're going to be under attack too. Okay, maybe I could make my products in America, but then my price structure will have to go up. So I can't give you an exact answer because it'll vary by product, but the wisdom aspect is to take action, but don't do anything hasty that you can't undo. Okay. And that's what I meant by the combination of wisdom and agility.
And so, one of the answers from the perspective of a company in China, call it an exporter, is that if they get subsidies, they can change the price. What else can they do to be competitive? Do you think that they will just sell to other countries? Do you expect more strategic initiatives from those companies? Sales locally? What do you think the companies will do to try to, I guess, even out their business or stabilize it so that tariffs won't be as impactful? Just like you said, they can change all the time. So on a good side, if they were slapped with something hard, it could be undone. But on the negative side, you could get 20 and then another 20. You could see this kind of multi back and forth game going on over time where you never really know if you're playing chess or checkers or, when you wake up in the morning, what game you're playing. So how does a management team actually deal with it? Do they try to just take their ball and go elsewhere? Or is the U.S. just such a large market that they say like, okay, well, we're in it. We're just going to have to navigate this and like as we get information.
Well, okay. So again, keep in mind, we're talking about, our focus is on the U.S. companies, right? I mean, there's some people ask me, what will the Chinese companies do? And the equation,
companies do.
Say again?
What will the Chinese companies do?
Well, I mean, the Chinese companies have a very different challenge. And for them, to a certain extent, it's not as bad or not as big a concern because they literally have the world at their feet. So if they were competitive enough to sell lots of products to America, chances are they can do the same thing to Southeast Asia, to Africa, to Europe, of course. But Europe is tightening up because one of the champion products that China is making, namely electric cars, is creating headaches for the automotive industry in Europe. But within limits, a Chinese manufacturer is not in a bad position. They would like to retain their U.S. customers, though. If you switch and you look at it from the point of view of a U.S. player, the argument is very different because it's their market that is at stake. And in that dynamic, again, their main concern is not really what the market will bear. It's what the competition will do.
Right.
And so their concern is, I want to be sure, pretending to be them, that what I do is better than what the other guy will do. Mm-hmm. Because if they can somehow get their product to market cheaper than I can, not by 40%, like I mentioned earlier, but by 3%, I could lose serious market share. So what do I do to protect that? And if China has 60%, but nobody else can make that product, guess what? We will sell it for 60% more. I'm oversimplifying, but right. You get my drift. And so the U.S. buyer is going to be confronted by the dynamics that affect his marketplace. Now, some of the U.S. buyers have to deal with overseas markets because there's a significant amount of U.S. imports that come from China that are actually components that fit into U.S. products that are then exported overseas. And obviously, if those products come in with 60% more tariff, that's going to affect their ability to compete overseas. But again, it's a complicated mix, Nadine, and it'll vary from product to product.
And you gave the answer already, but you think that these tariffs are going to be inflationary. That is there any way to not make it that way in your mind, or do you think it'll be inflationary for the world, or how do you think about that?
No, I think of course it's going to be. Look, the romance of tariffs is that it makes money for the government and everything else stays the same. That's fiction, right? I mean, anybody that understands mathematics understands that if you increase the costs, at the end of the day, the end user is going to pay for it. And that's inflationary. And it's inflationary in many different ways, some of which are, I guess, unexpected. But I'm thinking of, there's an interesting paper from the Federal Bank of St. Louis about why it's inflationary. If you're interested, I can send it to you separately. But it's very compelling. The argument that, you can take a product that costs $10, I'm going to put 60% tariffs on it, and it's not going to create inflation. The only answer is nobody's buying it. But that's not the answer, right? You have to assume that the product continues to be sold. Passing on that will be inevitable if people want to survive financially. And so it's going to be inflationary. There is no doubt in my mind. I have spent a lot of time reading about it, calculating it. There's no way that you can portray this as not inflationary.
But you could have a situation where there's market share shifts, right? So, I read some toys or some gaming console was going up 30 or 40%. Well, there is demand elasticity to your point. And so, if you have a situation where, okay, the price is up, I'm not going to buy it because there's not new income out there. There's not new money. And I'm a big believer that the only source of inflation on an aggregate level is new money, new credit. So absent that, it's just going to be winners and losers. Some guys are going to win. They're going to manage it better. And I think the hope is to rebalance trade. Now, I don't think it's the smartest way to do that, but I do find it very difficult to see aggregate prices going up without aggregate money going up. So if you look at the S&P, margins are extremely high right now. That's a part of the margin, the price structure. It could be that the margins will have to be eaten, both on the importer side, but it sounds like you're saying the government would be, or the exporter, the government might subsidize that. And then domestically, it could be on the importer, and they'll try to pass some on without question. I won't argue against that. But again,
Sure.
you only have so much income, only so much credit to buy goods and services. So maybe it's one of those situations where the more discretionary you are, the more at risk you are.
Well, okay. So I agree with you that at a macroeconomic level, you could argue that if you put such huge tariffs on imports and nobody buys them anymore, in theory, that would mean that it's not inflationary. But it's not pragmatic. It's, in my opinion, it's not realistic. There is a lot of the products that China makes are products that we cannot make in this country as competitively. That's pretty much by definition what an import is. And if you increase the cost, if you say, well, some of these items are discretionary, you could make the case. But again, I mean, it gets complicated, Ben, because the U.S. economy is driven by consumers, right? Consumers spending money on products and services. And if you constrain their ability to buy by increasing prices, in my view, you're going to create an inflationary effect. And that inflation of cost, I think, is going to be more pronounced for the lower percentage of, the people that basically make less money and buy cheap products, as opposed to the top of the rich people who don't really necessarily spend that much on cheap China products. But again, look, it's a complicated case to make. In my view, I repeat, if you consider that a product brought into the country is slapped with tariffs, those tariffs will be passed on to the end user, to the consumer, if indeed the consumer is the end user, unless everybody knows that it's temporary. In other words, I'm slapping tariffs on for 2 months, and then after that, I'll take them away. But that is not happening. It hasn't happened. It could, but it hasn't happened. Therefore, the costs will be passed on, and therefore, assuming the market will continue to buy those products, it's going to be inflationary.
So just to follow that up then, so I have been in long Chinese stocks this year, and one of the ones that I've been really impressed with is this BYD car manufacturer that's looking like one of the best car companies in the world. And one of the arguments, because we've talked about tariffs, because tariffs for these auto EVs coming out of China have been top of mind before Trump. Because Biden was talking about this and the EU was talking about this because they're scared, right? There's a cost advantage, as you know better than anyone. And these guys are producing high quality cars now. So one of the things that we've talked about is this Belt and Road, or Rust and Belt, whatever it is. Initiative that they, like us after the Marshall Plan, post World War II, when the U.S. was the production engine of the world, had built out all these markets. So maybe there could be some share loss in the U.S., but now they're developing new markets and they're extending credit to them and, developing the global economy beyond just this U.S., EU, Japan, China, focused economy. With maybe a few other countries like in there. But what do you think about that? As a guy who's sourcing and advising, are you starting to see more focus on some of these other markets, or is it not big enough yet to offset maybe if they do 60% or some crazy tariff?
Okay, well, I mean, so during the first Trump administration, China, if you look at statistics, it's kind of uncanny, but China's exports did not go down. If anything, they went up. And whatever China lost in terms of volume in the U.S. market, it regained and then some in other markets. Right? So China has done a very good job at penetrating Western markets. And when you think about it, it's not surprising. In other words, if you can sell to the U.S. market, which is very fussy about quality and everything else, chances are you can sell anywhere else in the world. And that's what China put to work, and a lot of and they had a lot of success in doing that. When you talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, it's a slightly different thing. This is a government initiative. You compared it a little bit to the Marshall Plan, which is an interesting point of comparison in the sense that it too was a government initiative, but that's pretty much where the comparison ends. The Marshall Plan was a very different, both conceptually and in practice, to the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road is really something that the Chinese government is doing, first of all, because of its geographical position. If you think about China and you reflect on all the countries that surround it, you would not be very comfortable, and you would need to deal with that. And one way to deal with it is through soft power, which is expressed in a nice way through this Belt and Road initiative. And the other thing is, the Belt and Road is a welcome sign that China is participating in the global economy. It's a good thing. When you talk about the Chinese electric car manufacturing, which are becoming extremely good at what they're doing, and you don't have to take my word for it. You can ask the CEO of Ford Corporation.
Europe, they love him.
Yeah, well, they love them. They love them in China. But even, the head of Ford.
He loves it.
Yeah, he was wowed by that. But here, what chagrins me about all this is that as a capitalist, I don't like it when people are trying to constrain competition just to protect their own stuff. We tried that way back then with our automotive industry. I don't know if you remember the days of preventing the Japanese from entering the market. What happened when we finally let them in? Tell you what happened. The quality of U.S. cars went way up, and the prices went down. And who benefited? The consumer. And this to me is what we call market forces. This is what capitalists believe in. And this whole concept of protectionism, to me, is an indication of, on one extreme, cowardice, on another, political convenience.
Michael, can I ask a question about, so China obviously had a huge rise in manufacturing and exports, given its lower cost nature, ability to have quality goods servicing the U.S. Given geopolitics, given potential tariffs, and then competition from other emerging markets who may not have the same geopolitical tensions with the U.S., how do you see China's role with the U.S. going forward, and U.S. companies, call it, whether it's shoring up their supply chains, transitioning them, and other emerging markets who now oftentimes offer cheaper goods? Well, you can argue is the quality there or not, but certainly from a labor perspective can be cheaper. So where is China's place going forward, given some of these dynamics?
Sorry, Nadine, Can you recast your question?
Given that other emerging markets may have lower cost base for labor and other factors, in addition to geopolitics, so U.S. companies might either just be concerned about the unknown of doing business in China these days with the new administration, or even it could be cultural, right? So Chinese consumers preferring to buy mainland China goods versus U.S. goods. How do you foresee China's role changing, given some of these dynamics going on? Do you think supply chains are going to be focused more on countries that might be more friendlier with the U.S., or at least don't have the same, call it, headline stigma that China does with the U.S.? Or where is China's role going to be in the next 5 to 15 years in your mind?
Boy, you really love easy questions, Nadine. Okay.
I want to know your thoughts. These are key questions that I sit here thinking about. So I imagine
Right.
you.
Well, I'm not questioning the validity of your question. I'm just pointing out that they are tough questions. All right. So let me try and unwrap this a bit. There's a couple of elements here. There is the element of how does China protect its own economy given the current negative geopolitical dynamics that it has created, because let's face it, it was certainly a major contributor in that creation of tension with the United States. And secondly, what separate issue, frankly, what are the U.S. companies that are business companies that are active in China? How are they supposed to behave in the future? Now, so let's all understand that a key thing about this question in answering the future is that it's unpredictable and nobody's got a crystal ball. But it's easier to do today than it was 40 years ago. And I would say that China is going to face a big component of Chinese GDP today is exports. And I think China needs to come to terms with the possibility that it's going to lose that. Right? It's not going to lose all of it. It's going to lose the size of it. It's going to be smaller in the future. And the way to remedy that is to increase its the consumer component of its GDP. China has about 40%. 40% of its GDP today is generated by Chinese consumers, whereas in the U.S. it's nearly double. It's 70%. And so China would need to move in that direction. Now, that's easier said than done. Michael Pettis, which is a guy that a brilliant economist that Ben often refers to, has often talked about this. It's a difficult transition, but I think China will be forced to take it. It's also somewhat unpalatable because that's kind of a Western model, right? Like the way I get out of my economic problems is by imitating the United States. They don't want to imitate they want the United States to imitate them. But that's an ideological concern, not really something I worry too much about. So, what is China going to do for the next 10, 15, 20 years? I think China has a lot of problems that we are painfully aware of. The big one is, the real estate issue. There are problems that are perhaps not quite as obvious, but that part of the scenery, which have to do with autocratic government, people that surround themselves with yes men, not necessarily perhaps going in the smartest way about things. But that's what we hear a lot about in the media in the West, where China also possesses a lot of advantages. And again, Ben mentioned some of them. Worthwhile reminding ourselves, solar power, electric cars, the ability, even in chips where China is severely constrained, there's breaking through and starting to making their own, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, and also the soft power that you mentioned earlier, the the BRI initiative is going to give China access to a whole slew of markets, all of which, or most of which, are emerging and therefore have potential over the next 10, 20 years, etc. Another factor you need to keep in mind, which is an unknown but pretty much a certainty, and that is that Xi Jinping will no longer be in power 20 years from now. What does that mean? Again, we don't know. What we do know is that it will be pivotal. Just like the death of Mao Zedong caused China to move in a different direction, I think the death of Xi Jinping is going to have a similar effect. Now, as far as the West is concerned, especially Western business, everybody talks about China exports, but let's also think about China as a market. There's a lot of interests in America that are keen on keeping China as a client, and the agricultural sector is one of them. But there's lots of powerful U.S. companies that want to keep China as a friend, some of which you've heard of, right? Tesla, Apple, Pfizer, these companies don't want to lose China. And so it's a two-way street. And from a geopolitical point of view, talk about wisdom, I think there's a lot of benefit to be intricately co-involved, right? If you're part of the same fabric, there's a good chance you don't want to destroy that fabric. So I think a lot of the sort of red flags that we hear are exaggerated. It's not going to be black, it's not going to be white, it's going to be somewhere in between, some gray, some shades of gray. And I'm an optimist, so I think businesses will continue to prosper.
And one thing you've taught me was, that we're on the average age of a dynasty in China, and that's where the CCP's at right now, or maybe just a little past it. And you were telling me they're very aware of that. And you told me this framework of think about the CCP in terms of they want to stay in power as their top priority, and that confuses some people in the West sometimes. So maybe use that framework and then just talk about Taiwan, or talk about, hey, we've been protectionists or mercantilists on our currency, or there's these things where they're protecting themselves, and then that's how you can see what they're doing. Not necessarily they're rich. It's not that they're like, oh, we need all the money. They're thinking about maybe power as the top thing, and maybe just frame that with the Taiwan thing, because obviously that's the biggest hot button, unknown in the global economy.
Yeah, and again, very good point. It speaks to a cultural divide. A lot of us are not really aware of it, because we're used to our own systems, we're used to our own cadence. For us, it's normal that every 4 years you elect a president, and it's kind of normal that the president may or may not change the course of the way governance is done. We think it's normal. But just because we think is normal doesn't mean that that's the way it's done over there. And it isn't. China is ruled by the Communist Party, the CCP. And it's important if you try to figure out, people say, what do you think China will do? These are difficult questions to answer. But one way to answer them is to think, what's good for the CCP? And to give you a little bit of context, because again, when you try and answer these questions, you inevitably simplify to make the answer clear. But of course, there's a lot of complexity in all of this stuff. But so the CCP, it's important to understand how they see themselves. They see themselves as, first of all, the savior of China. And they do this, I believe, genuinely. They see themselves as the protector of China against these Western values and all that. They also see themselves, as you hinted, Ben, as a sort of the extension of millennia of Chinese imperial governance, the next dynasty, although they won't use that word because it has, too many feudal connotations. But you tend to have that very strong feeling of that's what the Communist Party is. And I guess the big lesson to take away from it is that generally speaking, the Communist Party will be having China's best interest at heart. Whether it knows what to do and how to do is a separate issue, but the intention is there. So when you look at China and you say, what will China do in this circumstance? As you mentioned, Ben, it's a useful thing to do is to say, well, in what way would the Communist Party benefit? And so you mentioned Taiwan, which is always an interesting talking point, and a lot of people ask me, will China invade Taiwan? Will China use force to take over Taiwan? And that type of conversation. And again, use the same thing. How does that benefit the CCP? And the answer is pretty obvious. The status quo benefits the CCP, right? The status quo is safe. The CCP is safe with Taiwan as it is. If Taiwan changes dramatically and thumbs its nose at China and starts becoming officially independent and recognized by the United Nations and an independent country and all of that, that threatens the role of the CCP as the protector of China, and then the CCP will be potentially forced to do something. But short of that, there's very little incentive for the CCP to take military action against Taiwan. The risk-reward ratio is definitely not in its favor, as we have observed in Ukraine. It's not an easy thing to take over somebody else's territory, especially, wash my mouth with soap, somebody else's, obviously. Taiwan is part of China. But
Yes.
you know what I'm saying. My point is there's a big risk, and the risk is simple. If you fail, Mr. Communist Party, you're out of here, right? It's not that you fail this little military escapade like Putin could do in the Ukraine, for example. If the outcome was that he has to go home, fine, he'll survive that. The Communist Party will not survive, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of Chinese, an exit, from a military confrontation with Taiwan. So they have to win. There's no other outcome, and the chances of their winning is not guaranteed, and that's enough. Not guarantee is enough. Why the heck should I do it if it's not guaranteed? So to me, I think right now Taiwan is not a big consideration. It's not a big concern of mine. But again, keep in mind another factor. Because it's a concern by a lot of people, because Biden says things like, I'm going to protect Taiwan, that also makes that reality less plausible for China. In other words, if everybody was complacent, then maybe China would try to do something. But under current circumstances, my opinion is that it seems unlikely. It doesn't help the Communist Party to do this. There's other reasons, including what I call the poison pill factor. How do you swallow a country or a region like Taiwan? It's much harder to do than you think, and it potentially is a threat to the Communist Party. One simple question. Right now, the Chinese, as you know, they have an isolated internet, so they don't really know what's happening in Taiwan. But if it becomes known to the average person in China that an average Taiwanese earns 11 times more than an average Chinese because they have a democratic system, how do you think that is going to go down? This is what I mean by the poison pill. It's leave it where it is. It's easier. It's better. Let's not mess with what doesn't bother me right now. Again, these are just my views.
Right. And
can I ask you a question about, the economic slump in China has lasted a few years here. And obviously, it's okay if you can blame it on other people, but after a while, your people look at you and then you're the source of that problem, right? And so can you explain to folks who may not be as insightful, I guess, on the ground of why they would be doing this. Is it just not at a level that is bad enough, therefore they could keep doing it? Or at what point does it get too painful for Xi such that the government has to do something to improve the economy? So why would he let it go this long versus shoring it up somehow with even more stimulus? Because it hasn't been really enough, right?
Okay. And again, excellent question, Nadine. And complicated and difficult to answer because things are not always what they seem. So yes, the Chinese economy is struggling. It is deflationary at this time. And another aspect is that the economy is all important for the Communist Party. In other words, they cannot afford for the economy to go down the drain. Now, they can afford for the economy, as you pointed out, to be ailing a bit up to a point because they use coercive methods of information control, et cetera, and so as long as the majority of the people, and by majority, all of us here understand the poor people because they're still the majority. And as long as they are more or less taken care of, and they don't notice too much problem, then the economy is okay. But again, be mindful, and this is important and worth emphasizing. If there's one thing that keeps Xi Jinping awake at night, it would be that the people would revolt. And the people would revolt because of the economy. And if you're going to say, well, why is that a concern? Well, that's because, historically speaking, that's how the communists got to power, because the people revolted. They understand the power of the people. So you can't allow that to happen. So you must protect the economy. Then you got to find ways for the economy to continue. And some of that takes us back to what we spoke about before, maintaining exports and the dynamism of Chinese industries, electric cars, et cetera, et cetera. But
so given your point, is it just that the less economically advantaged people aren't really feeling it, and it's just the higher income people who are feeling it, or just it's not at a level that it's caused enough pain that they can continue on this path? Where are we on that pain threshold?
Well, okay. So first of all, we're getting there on the pain threshold, and you don't have to take my word for it. You can just see it by the actions that the Chinese government has taken recently, actions that that many economists think are not enough. But again, we're measuring things with a Western yardstick. One of the concerns that the Chinese have, that Xi Jinping specifically has, is this nanny state concern, which he sees both as a Western type thing to do. It's sort of anti-revolutionary. He comes from a generation, his father before him, of revolutionary fighters. He thinks the Chinese youth is too fragile, blah, blah. And he would like to sort of, inject a bit more backbone into that. And he thinks that's how China is going to become strong in the future, etc. So he's reluctant to put too much into social stability in the sense of free Medicare and things like that. But again, we spoke about this earlier. If you're going to create, and remember what I said about that too, but if you're going to create a consumer that's going to contribute to the GDP, you're going to need to free that consumer from the worries that keeps his money in the bank. Because right now, the average Chinese guy,
right,
they keep money in the bank in case they get sick. Like, I'm going to have to, go to the hospital. I'm going to have to pay lots of money for it just in case, and what if, and again, the Chinese, you guys are very familiar with the field of investment. Chinese don't have many avenues to invest. One of the great avenues used to be real estate, but you know how that went. So what have you got? You've got the Chinese stock market. Chinese stock market is a fake stock market. Let's not forget about that. And let's start by thinking that the stock market is not a communist institution, right? So, and what I mean by fake market, because I see Ben laughing, but fake stock market is one where people put their fingers on the scale, and those people happen to be the Chinese government. And if you do that, then everybody tries to factor in that finger on the scale thing, which is difficult to factor in, similar to tariffs, by the way. So the Chinese investor, in other words, doesn't have a lot of options. The safest option tends to be what? Keep the money in the bank. And to a certain extent, the Chinese government takes advantage of this huge pool, trillions of dollars that, that the Chinese people at large have put in the bank. And that, if that's going to change, it's going to be painful. And obviously the Chinese government, I think, knows that it has to do something about this, but it also will try, and you can't blame it, to try and make the pain as little as possible.
Yeah. And so, it's just an interesting give and take that people in the West and the people in finance have of, do they protect the stock market like we do in the West, or do they kind of protect their power and the bond market? Because Chinese bonds have been excellent this year. The Chinese bond market has been quite impressive. And the Chinese stock market's had a nice little rally. But to your point, I don't think that that's their priority. It's clearly not their priority. And so it comes back to kind of your framework that we've talked about and that I use, that it's like, these are good companies. This is a good economy, but they have a different priority set than we have. So, just to round it off, if you had to say 108 or 8 or 6 for the FX, I think you said weaker is where you lean, that would kind of be more in line with their policy objectives.
So you're talking about the renminbi depreciation.
US dollar.
Yeah, I would think that if tariffs come in hot and heavy, the renminbi will indeed move towards 8. But it's just an educated guess. That would be, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be slow. It's going to move in that direction. The Chinese government is not one to make these instant sort of corrections especially to such things as currency.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, we could probably spend more hours with you discussing everything you know about China and trying to forecast the future here with global trade and their positioning. But thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. If our listeners want to connect with you or hear more about what you're up to, or just want to get in touch with you and your firms, where can they do that?
Well, they can go on our website. I don't know if you can post that somewhere.
We will. And what's
yeah, and so if you go to cpgsourcing.com,
okay,
pretty much as it's pronounced, that's where you will find us. And again, it's interesting because China moved from flavor of the month to buy stuff from to challenge of the month.
right.
But it creates very interesting dynamics for companies who want to continue to thrive under a changing global environment, especially one where U.S. politics have changed so dramatically.
So 2 things. One, hopefully you can check back in with us in the future once we've seen next year what comes down the pike from all sides on this, whether it's the tariff wars or policies or geopolitics going on. But second of all, how do you say just think about it in Mandarin? Can you shed some light on it for us?
Just think about it. So 你就这么想。But actually, I'm thinking, so Just Think About It is a great title in English. But it's a great title because it potentially means different things to different people, right? And and that title is taken. It's not a phrase in itself. It's a piece of a phrase. And
Right.
a lot of the time in Mandarin, you would use context. But 你就这么想，你就这么想，
All right.
Jordan,
That's the
Timo
final
Shaw.
或
one.
者是让你这么想。
All right. Well,
Oh,
thank
wonderful. Thank you.
Which reminds me, Nadine, people ask me, oh, you speak Chinese? Can you say something in Chinese? And my old stand-in joke that Ben knows is, yeah, I can say something in Chinese. And I tell them, 这是什么意思? And they look at me and they go, what does that mean? And I say, well, how did you know?
Thank you so much.
All right, Nadine, thank you. And thank you, Ben. Great podcast. Congratulations again.
Thanks for coming on, buddy.